Good morning, everyone. I hope that you're well. Thank you so much for being with us today in person. I know we also have colleagues joining us online, so great to have their participation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the session on sparing water from armed conflicts, building a coalition of action. I'm Monica Ramos. I'm the Global WASH Cluster Coordinator based here in Geneva with UNICEF, and it's really a pleasure to be here today to moderate this excellent panel. We have some very distinguished speakers with us today, and we're really looking forward to having a great dialogue with all of you. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the Ambassador, Ms. Anita Pipen, the Permanent Representative of Slovenia to the UN in Geneva.
Thank you, Monica. Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce this important Geneva Peace Week event, which aims to build a coalition of action to spare water from armed conflicts. I'm grateful to our partners, to our panelists, to our moderator, and all of you for bringing your expertise to the table. We will, in most general terms, be addressing the interconnectedness of water and peace. Slovenia is a long-time supporter of all the international and national efforts to protect water resources and water infrastructure, emphasizing the relevance of water for human development, preservation of ecosystems, climate resilience, and last but not least, peace and security. My country is a place of abundant and clear water resources with good expertise in integrated water resource management. The right to drinking water is enshrined in our constitution. Here in Geneva, Slovenia is chairing a group of friends of water and peace. And next week, our capital, Ljubljana, will host the 10th session of the meeting of the parties of the Water Convention. With over 500 participants, including many high-level representatives, this promises to be a pivotal gathering for advancing transboundary water cooperation. Water and Peace Nexus is also one of our priorities in the United Nations Security Council. We are advocating for the need to have water risks more systematically taken into account when the Security Council talks about conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace-building efforts. Dear participants, as we speak, in conflict zones like Gaza, Sudan, Syria, and elsewhere, access to water is a critical matter of survival. The alarming rise of the weaponization of water in contemporary armed conflicts is imposing a heavy toll on civilians who bear the devastating consequences of this phenomenon. In such contexts, water and water-related installations not only become casualties, but are also misused as means or method of warfare, profoundly affecting civilian livelihoods. Besides this, most modern water systems are digitized, making them more susceptible amid the growing trend of cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure. These are some of the considerations behind the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflicts, one of our most ambitious initiatives. Since the launch in May 2024 in New York, my country, together with a wide coalition of member states, civil society, NGOs, and others, have strived to demonstrate both the direct and reverberating effects of attacks on or damages to water-related installations. As mentioned, these attacks can lead to long-term impacts on livelihoods, well-being, and human dignity. They can lead to public health concerns such as contamination and infectious diseases. They can lead to displacement and to societal instability. During our event today, we are hoping to hear more on how the armed conflicts impact water resources. We hope to exchange views on how to reduce gaps between the existing legal frameworks and their implementation, underscoring the importance of international humanitarian law and human rights law. We hope to hear how to strengthen collaboration among humanitarian, development, and peace actors in pre-conflict preparedness, in resilience building, among others. To conclude, let us bring the energy and move together to ensure that in conflicts, civilian water infrastructure and resources are protected without fail. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those wonderful opening remarks that take us into this session during the Geneva Peace Week. So we will turn it over to the panel now. We will have times for questions and answers, but we will go through a structured dialogue with the various panelists, and then we will take questions and comments from the floor. So please do, if there is something that comes up, do note it down. We definitely want to hear from you, and we do have time. We have roughly about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So to our first panelist, I'd like to introduce Ms. Caroline Peton. She's the Director of Operations from the Geneva Water Hub. Hi, Caroline. Good morning. So just a quick question for you. What are the long-term and cumulative consequences of attacks on water and water installations? And also, how can we promote a better understanding and develop an action plan to prevent civilian harm? Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Monica. I think over the last 2 years, you've each followed the headlines of the news and about the destruction of and pollution of water in Ukraine, in Gaza, and more recently in Lebanon. And attacks on water systems and related infrastructures are widespread. And in the past decade, the use of water as a weapon of war has escalated dramatically. And the Pacific Institute has just released its update of its water conflict chronology, recording 347 events in 2023 to about just 22 in 2000. But what lies beyond these headlines? What are the long-term consequences for the affected populations? I'd just like us to take a moment and reflect. Who among you has a water bottle with you today? Yeah, great, thanks. Now think how easy it is to fill your water bottle throughout the day. I'd like to take you now and imagine yourself in Gaza, in Ukraine, or in Sudan. What would life be like if you couldn't fill your water bottle just when you want? And worse yet, when you try to go to a water point, you put your life in danger. And worse also, that when you can access to water, and when you collect water, will it be enough for drinking, for washing, for cooking, to sustain your family's basic needs? And then there's the quality of water. In conflict zones, chemicals used to purify water are in short supply. And the energy required to provide water or run water treatment plants is often unreliable or non-existent. And this creates severe risks of contamination or outbreaks of waterborne diseases like cholera. I'd like just to share an example of when I was working in Yemen, and I think Daoud will also share other examples from Yemen. In 2015 in Aden, damage to the electrical grid shut down a water pumping station, cutting off water to thousands. This, combined with the accumulation of wastewater in the city, made it impossible to maintain sanitary conditions for the populations, leading to the spread of cholera, with dire consequences 6 months after the stop of the pumping station. And now consider what happens when the conflict drags on for years, as you have seen in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. The longer the conflict, the more fragile water and energy infrastructure become, and the greater the risk of a system-wide collapse. And this affects every aspect of socio-economic development and, most importantly, public health. And protracted conflicts magnify these reverberating effects, as infrastructure degradation deepens over time, making rehabilitation efforts more complex and costly, as urban services become increasingly vulnerable to market supply disruptions, further straining supply chains, and as skilled personnel, crucial to maintaining these systems, often flee conflict zones, leaving a void in the technical expertise. And the above highlights the urgent need to protect freshwater sources in time of war, and how important it is to strengthen international humanitarian law. And Abby will delve more into this topic. It takes years to rebuild water infrastructure and clean water from pollution. The signing of a ceasefire or a peace agreement does not mean a return to normalcy. In Syria, even a decade after the start of the conflict, only 50% of water and sanitation systems function properly across Syria, in a region where about 98% of the population had access in urban areas. In northern Syria, more particularly, during the conflict, factions have weaponized water access, cutting supplies to communities for political or military gain. For example, disruptions to the electrical grid and the Aluk water station, vital to nearly 500,000 people, have left civilians in severe hardship. Years of conflict took its toll on the resilience of the station, which is now further impacted by climate change. The long-term consequences of these attacks extend also far beyond the conflict zone, and we see this with the Syrian refugees in Jordan or Malians seeking refuge in Mauritania. And these effects persist long after the fighting ends. While it's easier to count the direct casualties of war, we must also focus on the indirect toll on civilians' life due to water scarcity or contamination. Sparing water from the destruction of armed conflict is not just about ensuring its delivery. Water is fundamental to survival. It's about food security, livelihoods, public health, and above all, human dignity. And that's why the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflict, initiated by Slovenia, Switzerland, and the Geneva Water Hub, composed of state and non-state actors, is so crucial. The Alliance will promote evidence-based decision-making and inform policy development. It will facilitate knowledge sharing and dialogue to protect water sources from harm. By deepening our understanding of the destruction of water systems, we can improve legal protection and strengthen international law. And for this, collaboration is key. Diverse partnerships between peace, development, and humanitarian actors are essential to building resilience. Together, we can enhance monitoring, reporting, and accountability. Together, we can share experiences, knowledge, and insights to build a culture of compliance with IHL and ensure water as a fundamental human right is protected in times of conflict. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. Let's give her a round of applause. Wonderful. So moving on to our next esteemed speaker on the panel, we have the retired Brigadier General Godard Busini. He's the former chief of the legal services for the Ugandan People's Defense Forces. And the question is really focusing on, at the military level, how can the reverberating impacts of attacks, pollution, or destruction of water better inform a duty to prevent reasonably foreseeable harm to the civilians? Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And my colleague who has just spoken has laid the background to our discussion. Basically, well, if I don't answer the question directly, you have to seek clarification later. You have the question time. I'm also, in addition to having been in the military until last month, after 39 years of service, I'm an emeritus professor of law at Kampala International University, majoring in environmental and natural resources law, and I've done a lot of work on water at the private level, consultancies. Well, as a soldier, I want to start by saying what makes one a soldier, or what does a soldier, how does a civilian transit into becoming a soldier? First and foremost, training, military training for self-preservation, for protecting and preserving your colleagues in combat, protecting the civilians and the environment you live, you operate in. So that makes you a soldier. You're able to protect yourself, your colleagues, the civilian population, and the environment, including water resources. Now, the unfortunate bit is that a soldier does not command himself or herself. We have the concept of command-in-chief. It is the executive that commands the soldiers in the battlefield. Soldiers have hierarchies, the command structure. You have the army commander who takes orders from the civilian political elite. And these are the ones who determine what type of weapons, what type of methods you are going to use in the field. Because the political elite are always struggling for their survival in the political seat. We know what is happening. For example, in the US now, you can see the misinformation, disinformation going on around the Trump and the Democrats. So that tells you that once somebody is in office as a political leader, he or she must make sure that his or her ideological inclinations are implemented by the defense forces. And that puts us in a dilemma on how the military can protect water and water resources during an armed conflict situation. We see what is happening in the war-torn areas, the weapons that are being used, what happens in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, South Lebanon, in Syria and other places. All those are intended to protect the political elite. Otherwise, the military would be organized. For us to survive, you must survive on the natural environment. I will just give you an overview of where I come from. We don't have water bottles as you have here. Wherever you go, you find water. Uganda is known as a part of Africa gifted by nature. We have water resources everywhere. We take the largest share of the Lake Victoria, the largest lake on the continent, shared between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. We are the source of River Nile and many other water bodies. And when we were fighting previously, we would depend on nature. Water, drinking water from the well, from the rivers, from the lake, clean water. But the situation has changed because of armed conflicts. In the neighborhood, we come from an area which is turbulent, Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, even us, previously we had those conflicts. So we get problems with the water contamination, water pollution. We have not had serious issues of destruction of water infrastructure because there are very few on the ground as well. We had an experience during the Rwanda genocide. Bodies were thrown in the river. We are the source of River Nile, but it gets tributaries from Rwanda through Lake Victoria. Bodies floated over 200 kilometers on the water. So many bodies came to Uganda, which was, of course, would have been prevented if there was no armed conflict. So back to the specific question. The military trains on the militaries are rule-based organizations. And we know IHR constrains the military from doing what is not supposed to be done, from targeting water resources, water infrastructure, and other aspects of survival of the civilian population. But as I said, the commanders-in-chief will determine what you do in the field. Commanders-in-chief can shuffle the commanders. Anytime, army commanders can be shuffled. We have had ministers of defense, I think, in Ukraine changing from time to time. If you don't do the right thing, your commander-in-chief will shuffle you, and you may be court-martialed. That is another dilemma that we live in. So the political elite trains the army, maintains it, remunerates it, in line with their political ideological inclinations. And here I've said terms and conditions apply. Being in the military is a risky life. When I retired last month, people were asking, how can you serve for 39 years when you have never gone to prison? I said, I have never gone to prison. That is it. I didn't go to the military to go to prison to serve my country. So it's a challenge that we meet in the militaries. We try as much as possible to avoid using means and methods, but we don't acquire them as the militaries. They are acquired by our political elites. So you must use them. But of course, we are constrained, and as I said, you must use only those means and methods that are supposed to be helping you to achieve your deliberate, definite military objective. And from that, I want to just highlight a few things, then I conclude. One of the aspects that makes us do the right thing avoid making water and water infrastructure our deliberate military objectives is training on how to survive yourself. Because if you don't survive, if you destroy the water, you might be in the wilderness for so long. How would you survive in polluted environment? Train on arms. Insist to the political elite that we must have only those arms that cannot violate the law. We do arms reviews. Of course, we are the experts when they are purchasing arms. We check the arms that we are going to buy for the governments and use them. And so we have a hand also to play. We don't want to blame the political elites because we are the experts and we tell them what to handle. So we train on IHL principles generally. Now we have got like the Geneva list of principles. When I was still in service, we have a training center. We would train our soldiers on the general water principles, the Geneva water principles. Train on how to fight by the rules, very critical. And if you mess up, the military works in a precarious situation. The lowest person will suffer first if he or she messes on the front line. Train on the nationally agreed upon rules of engagement that will help you to achieve your military objectives. And we also engage with the commanders in chiefs. We tell them, you want us to do this, but we can't do it. Or would not do it because it would have reverberating effects on our environment. We insist on consciously doing the right thing when we are in training. Any mistake you do, you may survive the bullet of the enemy. You are in the wilderness and fail to survive because there is no clean water, there is no something to survive on in the wilderness. So in conclusion, we see that the attacks, destruction, and pollution of water resources, destruction of the environment, is very dangerous to the soldier himself or herself first and foremost, before you consider any other person. And once those resources are safe for you, then they are safe for each and every person. And the knowledge of the reverberating effects of destroying or attacking or polluting water resources helps the soldier to comply with the law as such. So last I want to say that water should not be made the primary objective of military attacks, destruction, or pollution. Sadly, as I said, destruction of the enemy and enemy territory, including water, is often seen as the ultimate for the political elite. You want to disable the enemy by destroying the bridge, the water dam, the water installation. But if you destroy a nuclear installation, what will be the impact on the population, on the water itself? So the political elite, the commanding chiefs and the military commanders have an obligation to prevent reasonable foreseeable harm to water during conduct of hostilities. It's an obligation. Otherwise, they make themselves unable to prosecution in the international criminal tribunals, as you are aware. So basically, that is my intervention. I would entertain some questions so that I clarify on those aspects. But understand that the soldier is a person that lives in an environment that he or she cannot have control on. Once it is an armed conflict, you go in the field. You are given the arms, which depend on the doctrine of the country. You don't determine. But you must also use your conscience that what you are doing will endanger your survival. And once you protect yourself, you protect the civilian, you protect the environment that you are living in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, former Brigade General. Thank you very much. So moving on to our next panelist, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Abby Zeth. She's the legal advisor with the ICRC. And we'd really like to hear from you, Abby, on so international law is applied with more and more elasticity. This year itself, we celebrate the 75 years of the Geneva Conventions. How can we promote a culture of compliance with international humanitarian law? And how does the ICRC, in terms of your guidelines on the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict, can be promoted amongst militaries? And do you have good practices that you might be able to share with us today? Thank you. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Monica, and good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. The issue of protecting and sparing water from armed conflicts is near and dear to the ICRC's work, and I'm really pleased to support the Alliance's work in this regard. This year we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, and it is very heartening in the conversations that I've had in the last few months, because there IHL is a resilient body of law. We have seen this uniquely powerful tool save countless lives over the decades and ensure respect and protection for thousands of detainees and medical patients, and the protection of critical infrastructure that's essential for the provision of water. And that's despite war's devastation. We know that respect for IHL can be an important first step towards building trust and facilitating the path to peace when the parties decide to pursue it. There's simply no other impartial and universal set of norms that compel restraint by all sides. Now, of course, as we celebrate IHL's enduring strength, we must also pay attention to its contemporary challenges, and the recent past has proven that IHL is essential, but it has also revealed the urgent need to reinforce it. As we've seen, deliberate violations are far too common, and there is little that is done to prevent their reoccurrence and hold state and non-state perpetrators to account. As we've already heard, it is critical that states train and discipline their own personnel. They need to empower their judiciary to prosecute and punish those who commit war crimes, and they need to cooperate with international institutions to prevent impunity. As we've seen so often in our operations throughout across the globe, carelessness during hostilities leads to devastating mistakes with horrific destruction to critical infrastructure that's necessary for the provision of essential services. Parties need to work to eliminate these devastating errors in hostilities, not only by training their fighting forces, but improving their targeting practices, improving their operational planning processes, and by exercising all feasible precautions in attack. Apologies and expressions of regret, however sincere, do fall well short of IHL's requirements. Now, it's important that non-state armed groups also take these similar steps and reject the use of asymmetric capabilities or IHL's perceived Western origins as excuses for non-compliance. It is clear that the norms that are set out in IHL have roots in legal, social, religious, and ethical traditions that span the globe, and anchoring the laws of war in these can be an effective way to absorb them. In our view, armed groups must do more to take ownership of the law. Another concern for us is that problematic legal interpretations are undermining IHL's protective effect, which is reducing protections for critical infrastructure necessary for sustaining essential services and the natural environment. We're seeing the balance between humanitarian principles and military necessity, which are central to all military operations, being increasingly strained. So for the law to remain effective in governing warfare, and we need to interpret and apply IHL treaties in good faith, respecting the original object and purpose of these treaties, but also recognising the legal developments that have occurred since and the diverse impacts of conflict on different groups. Moreover, states must refrain from transferring weapons when there is a substantial or clear risk that they will be used in violation of IHL. And also the ICRC's view is that states must condition or limit the transfer and use of arms or take timely, robust and practical measures that can realistically offset the risk of violations both before and after delivery. We also at the ICRC encourage states to voluntarily report on their IHL implementation efforts and to share best practices at the regional and international levels, because this can foster mutual learning. And the final point I wanted to make on this particular question on how do we engender a culture of compliance on IHL more generally is that dehumanising enemy forces and civilian populations associated with them must end. If states remain indifferent as human lives are devalued because of nationality, race, religion or politics, the scale is irreversibly tipped and the foundation of IHL's legitimacy collapses. Every 4 years at our International Conference for the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, the ICRC calls on states and parties to enhance their protection for war victims. And as we approach the 34th International Conference in Geneva at the end of this month, we are going to renew that urgent plea. And just last month, we released our quadrennial IHL Challenges report, which documents a number of the challenges we see within the ICRC in terms of IHL compliance, particularly on building a culture of compliance. And so I'd encourage you to take a closer look if you're interested. So moving from the question of how to engender a culture of IHL compliance more generally, turning to the question of ICRC's guidelines on the protection of the natural environment and how they can be promoted amongst militaries and good practices. So the ICRC has produced these guidelines a few years ago. We set out 32 relevant IHL rules and recommendations. And in 2023, Switzerland and the ICRC hosted a state expert meeting on IHL, protecting the environment in armed conflicts, during which government experts from more than 120 countries shared challenges and good practices. At the ICRC, this is part of our commitment to climate action and environmental protection in armed conflict. We want to see states and non-state armed groups accelerating the implementation of IHL rules protecting the natural environment. At our expert meeting, we heard of many good practices being implemented by states with respect to operational planning, particularly involving environmental expertise in the planning process from the tactical through to the strategic level. We heard of creative ways to use open source information and remote sensing in order to better understand the environment within which militaries are operating, particularly the implications and risks for the natural environment, and in particular important areas of fragility. Our challenges report that I mentioned before speaks of 3 legal issues when it comes to environmental protection in armed conflict, and we want states to urgently update their interpretations and approaches. We want them to take more account of the protection of the natural environment when applying those key rules on the conduct of hostilities, that is distinction, proportionality, and precautions. We would like states to clarify the meaning of the prohibition, the environmental prohibition on widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, the prohibition within IHL. For many years, states have debated that there is a lack of clarity to this prohibition against widespread, long-term, severe damage to the natural environments. And in our view at the ICRC, there is sufficient evidence and state practice to clarify its meaning, but states need to start coming forward with their views on how to interpret that. The ICRC in its guidelines has offered its own interpretation, and we encourage that to states for further reading. And the third point is ensuring that parties to armed conflict pay greater attention to avoiding damage to areas of environmental importance or fragility. The ICRC's guidelines, as well as the UN International Law Commission's work on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict, has put forward similar protections to grant additional place-based protection to these areas. And we, in our view, this would be a particularly important development and encourage states to consider them. So those are just a few points on our guidelines on protection of the natural environment, but happy to discuss further in the Q&A.
Thank you, Abby. Okay, sorry. Moving on to our next panelist, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Dal Himrosh. He's the head of program for the Geneva Call based in Yemen. And so the question we'd like to hear you share with your thoughts with us today is, can you tell us more about the work that the Geneva Call is doing in Yemen? What role does water play when dialoguing with non-state armed groups? And how do you ensure that international humanitarian law and the access to safe water is respected? And what would be also your recommendations? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure most of us know that Yemen has been in conflict the last 10 years. According to the latest humanitarian needs, there are about 18 million people in Yemen who are in need of protection and humanitarian assistance, and about a third of the population do not have access to water. Another important thing to know about the context is that to a large extent the country is controlled by armed groups and de facto authorities. So some of the very good practices, like Brigadier Coded said about the Uganda People Defense Forces, may not apply because we are dealing with armed actors who are actively involved in an ongoing conflict. So I'll give a few examples of how the conflict particularly affected the water situation in Yemen. even before the conflict, Yemen was known as one of the countries that is water stressed. And the conflict, the last 10 years, has only exacerbated this situation, which is now extremely dire. If I give you a few examples, one of the third most populated cities of Yemen, called Taiz, is one city that is controlled by up to 3 armed actors who have different loyalties and who are actively involved in escalations. And to a large extent, most of the rich water reservoirs are under the control of one de facto authority, and the entire part of the city have no access to this. And half of the remaining water reservoirs are near contact zones that experience regular shelling and sniper attacks. This means the population have zero access to water, basically. So within the last few years, the population entirely depended on humanitarian organizations providing water and drilling new boreholes and providing water tracking. Yemen is also a country that has more than 4 million internally displaced people who entirely depend, again, on humanitarian aid to access water and other critical services. So armed actors have contributed to this dire situation in Yemen. So what do we do as Geneva Call in terms of contributing to sparing water from armed conflict? As I said, the country is largely under the control of armed groups and de facto authorities. In the north, it's a de facto authority. In the south, there are numerous fragmented armed groups. Most of them half related to the state, half non-state. And what we do is that we keep engaging with the leadership of the armed groups to make sure that they understand that water as a critical resource must be spared from the conflict, and that populations must have access to water always, and to also protect other critical infrastructure like healthcare, which also is a very bad situation. We also train the soldiers of the different armed groups on IHL and under the different thematic areas, most importantly, the protection of critical infrastructure like water bodies. Because the severe situation of water crisis also contributes to the health situation in Yemen. There constantly, almost every year, there's cholera and other diseases that break out, and this is largely contributed to lack of access to clean water. So there's this continuous engagement with armed actors to improve compliance, to make sure they make commitments that leads to compliance with IHL and compliance with protection of critical infrastructure that the society needs for survival. We also do, in some areas where the conflict directly affects communities and where armed groups control, make sure that the communities do not have direct access to water. We also organize civil dialogues to make sure the community and the armed actors can sit together and at least have some security arrangements that allow them to share resources, because sometimes armed groups take over resources which can be used by the whole community that live in a place, but an armed group can take, for example, a school or a health center or a water reservoir to use for their own needs. And sometimes the civil dialogues that we arrange try to resolve some of these issues, because peace is quite elusive in Yemen right now. I mean, there's a roadmap, and there's a lot of optimism, but there are also equal amount of challenges and setbacks, including the regional conflict that is always evolving. So because of this, peace is quite elusive, and we have to do a lot of community engagement and community-based dialogues with the armed groups to ensure that there are security arrangements that allow protection of civilians and access to water resources, healthcare, education, and such things. So I'm happy to answer any questions on Yemen. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dad, for all of that. So wonderful. I want to just give one last round of applause to all of our panelists. I think you've shared quite insightful viewpoints before we move into the Q&A and discussion. So one round of applause, please. Do we have a microphone? Okay, so we're now ready to take questions. We have about 25 minutes, so please do, if you can, direct your question at particular speakers, and happy to hear your comments. And yes, we have the microphone coming now. Thank you. Over to all of you.
First of all, thank you for all members of the panel for this captivating discussion. I had a question that kind of could be answered by any and all of you. It's a question related to the fact that, from what I've understood, the deprivation of water is a form of violence that is pretty invisible. It's physiological violence. It's indirect, and it's a form of violence that we do not see on TV, and that is less shocking than blood. And I'm wondering if you think that this invisibility of this type of violence can have an impact on the feeling of accountability of the different actors in the conflict in question, and if you think that there can be any steps to be taken to make actors more accountable by maybe bringing visibility to this type of violence. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for the question. Panelist, who would like to respond to that? Abby, Caroline? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for this great question. Indeed, we talk a lot about water, but it's very often forgotten and so crucial for the health of the population on the long term, and not just as we discussed, and not just on the moment of the conflict, but also 10 years down the line or further. So what can we do to make it more accountable? I think a lot of it is to inform, train all the parties to the conflict about the necessity to protect water, and it's not just the water infrastructure, it's also the environment, because once the water source is polluted, it's also impossible to recover from that. And that's why the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflict hopes to really bring this thematic at the higher political level. So working with partners on the ground to build case studies on the importance of protecting water, using specific context, like Yemen, for example, analyzing the trends over the last 10 years, and then from there having a discussion and see how we can influence decision makers or have a conversation at the UN level. Do we need a specific declaration or resolution to protect water? Those are discussions that are starting within the members of the Alliance. And I had another point, but I forgot to say. Yeah, but that's basically it. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, please come in.
Thank you for that question. Now, for the governments, it is critical that we improve on our military rules of engagement. And these military rules of engagement, military manuals, strategies, and action plans. Fortunately for the governments, we work with ICRC closely. And the ICRC scrutinizes our documents if the governments are open. Like in my country, I've been liaising with the ICRC on behalf of the Uganda People's Defense Forces for a number of years. We work on our documents, they review them. I participated as a peer review on the guidelines for the ICRC on protection of environment and other documents, and try to make sure that the forces, the national forces, respect the water sources. In conflict-prone areas, the hidden aspect that we don't talk about is gender-based violence. Women, children who are like on our continent are the ones who fend for their families, go for water, and they are timed. They are kidnapped, they are raped, they are defied, and whatever when they go to fetch water. So the obligation, of course, is on the forces, the actors, to be sensitive to that aspect, the gender aspect. Why, if you are fighting to overthrow the government, why should you target the weak who are struggling to survive in such an environment? So you are right, it is not normally pronounced. And the cultural aspects also complicate the situation. In some communities, I know where I come from, a woman who is raped will not speak out that she has been raped unless she has been seen, because that will destroy her marriage. Girls will be ashamed to say they were defied or raped because they will never get married. So there are also cultural issues that don't come out when we talk about protection of water and the environment, but it is real and on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Abby, Dad, would you like to come in?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. At the ICRC, one of the biggest things, and we've heard it several times, the panel, we are focused on ensuring that all warring parties understand the indirect effects of how they conduct their hostilities. And there is too much of a focus on the direct effects of munitions, the physical, damage, but not enough thinking about those indirect effects. And that's an education issue. And that's something that, the ICRC, our delegations across the globe, we work with partners, and we, in terms of trying to influence and inform warring belligerents and states on some of these challenges when it comes to indirect effects. The challenge with the law is that, the concept of proportionality in attack is limited to specific attacks. So you need to take into account all reasonably foreseeable direct and indirect effects of your attack. But we know that when it comes to issues with water, provision of water and sanitation, that often it's the cumulative impact of several attacks that end up causing so much devastation. And so what we encourage belligerents to do and states is to make sure that they are taking into account the possibility of these indirect effects at the earliest stages of planning. And making sure that in all of the earliest stages of planning that they understand the battle space within which they are operating and the risks to the infrastructure and the natural environment, and the risks that are and the damage that is likely to occur at a cumulative level. But that really, requires a substantial amount of training and education, but it also requires the right people to be next to the decision makers at the time. If you don't have an environmental specialist, if you don't have an engineer, if you don't have the right subject matter experts next to the commanders who are making those critical decisions, advising them on the risks to the provision of water and sanitation and protection of the natural environment, then those factors are not going to be taken into account. So that's probably my reaction to that question, but it's a great one. Thank you.
Before Dow jumps in, maybe I could say that part of the discussion of the alliance is also, do we need some protected areas that are defined before the onset of a conflict that would by default not be a target, and that would also inform based on IHL discussion.
Yeah. So I'll just contribute to the part of accountability. I mean, for armed groups who are involved in active conflict, and also de facto authorities, their priorities are usually different, because they are, like in Yemen, the first priority of every armed group is to control their territory and to defeat whoever they see as the enemy. So when you bring up issue of accountability and compliance, it slightly becomes like, well, this is not our priority. So sometimes we have to be very diplomatic and bring the community issue, and make sure you bring community and the armed groups together to understand each other on fairly mutual kind of understanding on how to save certain critical infrastructure, schools and water, so that they can at least share. The compliance with IHL is something that we always promote, and we train them about IHL on different thematic areas, including prevention of use of even harmful weapons and landmines. But again, in an active conflict with active front lines, with regular escalations in front lines, the priorities are usually very different. So we always have this balance, issue. And if you talk about accountability and holding military generals who are in active conflict accountable when they are not even accountable to anyone, especially in a civilian, where the civilian state structure is more or less dysfunctional, then that becomes an issue, and they can just not even listen to you sometimes. So this is an issue. I mean, we ultimately have to have an eye and keep an eye on all these things, and there must be accountability at some point. But on the ground, this becomes an issue of balance sometimes. So you have to prioritize the community protection, protection of the civilians, access to critical resources like water, and bring at least a community perspective to it. So these are some of the strategies that we employ in the field, but also communication. Yeah. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have a question here, and then we'll take, we can come here, and then we'll come to the, oh, sorry, you already have the microphone. Okay. Do you like to start? Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Andrea from the Permanent Mission of Switzerland here in Rabi. Sorry, I came a little bit late, Ambassador Pifan. Thank you very much for organizing this panel. It's advocacy for the protection of water and water-related installation from the consequence of armed conflict. This panel shows very well how the collaboration among all stakeholders is crucial to enhancing protection, implementing also international commitments. I would like to ask the following question: where to better advocate also in Geneva? We see that the advocacy must be built as a long-term issue, but also how can we pledge this protection, for instance, during the ICRC, the Red Movement, the 34th conference that will come at the end of this month. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the question. Who would like to respond on the panel in terms of the advocacy work that we can do collectively here in Geneva and beyond? Abby, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the question, and for the in terms of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement conference next, in a couple of weeks. There is a lot of activities and possibilities for promoting the protection of water infrastructure and the protection of the natural environment. I give one example, which is our work that we have been doing for the last several years on war in cities. So the ICRC has prioritized the issue of urban warfare, along with the movement more broadly, and so there is a comprehensive movement framework on protection of civilians and war in cities and continuity of essential services. And so we have been encouraging states to adopt pledges as part of our work on war in cities, and a number of those pledges which we are seeing that states may adopt or considering whether to adopt concern the protection and provision of essential services, the protection of water and sanitation, and issues related to the natural environment. So that's one concrete way at which states can do more or make a pledge to do more with respect to sparing water. The other point, it's also the other thing that I was thinking of was the work that's happening on the explosive weapons in populated areas. So in late November, in late November 2022, there was the adoption of this political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. I think we have about 87 states that have endorsed that at this point. And there are a number of political commitments within that declaration that if implemented in good faith, can be effective ways in order to spare water from armed conflicts. Now that we would like to see states who have endorsed that declaration to do more to show that they are effectively implementing it in their commitments, and there's a number of good practices that should be considered in this regard. So I think that is also advocacy around that in Geneva would also be important.
If I may add to that, the Geneva Water Hub, we will continue to work on promoting the work of the Alliance within the International Geneva. We collaborate with the group permanent missions of the Group of Friends on Water and Peace on that topic. There are several events that are organized by the Geneva Water Hub with partners, such as the one that will take place in the Graduate on the 12th of November on the issue of weaponization of water. And we will continue to work with all the international organizations working on that topic in Geneva. There's a wealth of expertise on different aspects of the protection of water that we can join this expertise together to build on the work of the Alliance.
Great. Maybe we move on to the next question, please, and then we'll come. Yeah, I think she's actually just left, unfortunately. So we'll come here and then we'll go to the next, please.
Hi, good morning.
Did she want to ask a question? Okay, I think she's leaving. Please, come in.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning. Julius Jackson with the Food and Agriculture Organization. Thanks very much for organizing this panel. I suppose my question is probably more for Caroline, but obviously for others as appropriate. Today is World Food Day, and the focus, the thematic this year is the right to food. And obviously, we don't have food if we don't have water. There's a clear link there. I'm curious as to what are the mechanisms that you foresee for the Alliance at the New York level with members. There's the Group of Friends on Water and Conflict, recognizing the difficulties at the highest levels of the United Nations system about getting entry points on discussion of this. We do have existing Security Council resolutions, 2417 on conflict and hunger, for example, and reporting mechanisms into that. And what other opportunities do you see, and indeed through 2417, what are you already considering on that? That forms part of my brief, actually, is 2417, so obviously subject to a later discussion perhaps as well. Thank you.
Great. Caroline?
Thank you very much for your question. Indeed, the Alliance is in a building progress, so we just launched it in May, and we had a few events around that. We still need to build on the non-state actors partnerships. So far, we've got on board UNICEF and Geneva Call. IUCN is thinking of joining, but there are other actors that are really, I think, crucial to the discussion of water, such as FAO, that we need to approach to include in this alliance. The alliance doesn't want to duplicate existing works. We really want to rally all the expertise and and build on what already exists at the UN level to see if we should. How can we strengthen already the existing mechanism, and if we need something else to develop? So 2417 will be part of the discussion. How can we contribute, or how can the case studies that we build contribute to feeding into that? So yeah, I'll be happy to further discuss with you.
Great, thank you. I believe we have a question in the back, please. Is it working? Okay, I think another one will come to the rescue.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'm Amsal from the Permanent Mission of Ethiopia. Thank you, Slovenia, for organizing these very important topics at this time. Yes, everyone do believe that protecting water sources should be a priority for any armed groups. However, as a gentleman from, I think, Rwanda says very well, the first priority for armed groups is just to protect themselves from their enemies. And I don't think so. I don't know if you have any experience that armed groups intentionally attack water areas. Maybe it will be very welcomed that if we can hear from experience. Otherwise, the situation may not allow the armed groups to first give priority to protect water and other civilian areas. Their first role and their first priority, I think, is just to protect themselves from their enemies. So when we come to accountable issue, do you think is it applicable to make them accountable, either the government or any non-state actors who are involving in affecting water source? Of course, not only water source, but also other important organizations and innocent civilians might be affected during conflicts. So how can it be applicable to make them accountable if once they attack the water source and other important areas? Otherwise, everyone would believe that protecting water source and civilians should be a priority for armed groups. Thank you very much.
Great. Godard and Dowd maybe after.
Thank you very much for that question. One, I reflect on my personal experience. I joined the forces as a non-state actor. The current government in my country, we fought the government since 1981 until 1986 January. And our mission was to overthrow the government by winning the hearts and minds of the population we are working with from. You know, we're in the center of the country, but the civilians protected us. Why? Because we never attacked their means of survival, including water. We protected the civilians, they protected us. So in order for an armed actor, especially non-state actors, to achieve their objective of overthrowing the government, they must work with the civilian population, they must comply with the IHR where they elect or not. They must sign those deeds of agreements, they must work with ICRC, Geneva Call, and other organizations. Period. Short of that, you'll never get out of the bush, you'll be destroyed there. The population will lick you if you... And we operated under a strict operational code of conduct. If anyone went beyond, punishment was maybe the last you could imagine. So that is one. But also now the current situation that we are living in, the militaries are advancing so much. Use of drones, for example, they help us to reduce casualties on our own side because we operate from the rear. But the targets we are seeing, if you see what is happening in the Gaza Strip, in the South Strip, and other places, it is unlikely that we are going to protect the water resources with unmanned aerial weapons. Because they are so, they may hit the target, but the effect is so much on the other side. So it's a challenge, especially in the modern world, when you talk about weapons and the protection of water resources. Because the civilian population in an armed conflict situation will be, will have to be close to water resources. And you destroy the civilian population, you destroy the water resources as well. It's a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Dowd, would you like to come in as well?
Yeah. So thank you so much for your question. For armed group, like I said, the priorities are different, but sometimes the communities find themselves in a situation where they fall in between two armed groups who are fighting. In such a case, it's important to insist on compliance with IHL, but also at the same time do actions that change the behavior of the armed actors through engagement and training to help them understand that they need to protect the community's social infrastructure. Like the example I gave you of ties, which is a very big debate always in Yemen, because it's one of the issues in Yemen where a critical resource, community resource, became a factor of war, because the water reservoirs on top of the mountains are entirely under the control of a de facto authority that has completely cut off the supply of the water to an entire city. So in such a case, there is the accountability part and the compliance with IHL, which is completely broken, and there has to be accountability at some point. But there's also the issue of how do we engage in the medium term and in the short term to make sure at least the supply of water to the community, because an entire city has no water. So this is why we have to work on behavior change and influencing the behavior and the practice of the armed actors to make sure they do not impede access to critical resources, but also I am sure there is also records kept for these kind of violations, and at some point there must be accountability. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. We do still have a few more minutes for questions. So we have one here and then one here. Anyone else? Hands up? Okay, great, thank you.
Can we in the same room? Okay. Thank you so much. My name is Adeline. I'm an independent consultant working in Geneva on on a number of issues, some of which is conducting conflict sensitivity assessments for large humanitarian NGOs. Some of those assessments have been with for the ICRC and large organizations that work on water infrastructure in post-conflict zones. So I've done these assessments in Eastern DRC and Lebanon more recently. And what those assessments have shown us is that a lot of the conflict has actually been exacerbated as a result of those organizations repairing the infrastructure or rebuilding the infrastructure. And so I was just wondering if this global alliance includes actors that are involved in the reconstruction of that infrastructure, and whether there is a discussion around the impact of those organizations on exacerbating conflict as a result of assisting on the reconstruction of the infrastructure. Also, the other point that I wanted to make was that we're talking a lot about the actors that are destroying the infrastructure, but what we also see is the impact of conflict indirectly on water sources and infrastructure. So, you know, the displacement of population, the control of that infrastructure from the non-state actors that are not always conflict actors. For example, the fact that water is quite a good source of income for a lot of the economic actors once it's not controlled anymore by the state. And so by rebuilding it and by giving it back, giving the management of that infrastructure back to the state, what you're also doing is that you're creating conflict with the economic actors who, prior to that, were controlling that income. So I was just wondering if there had been a discussion around that, and if you plan to include in your alliance those actors that are responsible for the reconstruction of infrastructure in the conflict zones. Thank you.
Great. Caroline, I think it's over to you.
Oh. Wow, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit before I can reply. I think the way we built the alliance was really in the first step to, we had an inception workshop where we really reflected about the state of art of what exists in terms of law, in terms of understanding of the destruction and the long-term consequences of the destruction of water, and how to better protect water from the destruction during conflict. So that's really the core heart of the reflection that we want to have at the Global Alliance. But for sure, I guess that we will have to, maybe not initially, but maybe a bit later, think about the reconstruction impact and how that builds in the post-conflict. But for now, I'd say the mandate of the Global Alliance is really to strengthen the knowledge and the legal respect for international humanitarian law on the protection from the destruction of the water from conflict. So not as a first step, but maybe later on, that's something we should definitely keep in mind if we start looking in the reconstruction phase. But it's really, it's really interesting discussions. Yeah, I think that one of the elements that the Alliance will take into consideration in the first step as well is the impact of refugees in other countries on the water availability. That's a bit an overspill of the conflict, but not so much going to the details as yet of the actors and the conflict sensitivity at the local level. We do that in other part of the works that we do in other regions, as Geneva Water Hub in the Sahel, more specifically. But for now, that would be there.
Great, thank you. So we have just 5 minutes left, and I think we have our last question here. The microphone, I believe, is coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I was just thinking around regarding to what do we know for what around water and environmental protection, and what are those gaps of knowledge that could be there is place and opportunities to incorporate to the current context of the alliance discussions, international conventions that are already in place. In your experience, in your knowledge, in those discussions, what will be those points? Maybe these 3 points that you mentioned. Do we need a special UN convention? What will be those aspects in concrete that policymakers could identify? We know this, and we have this gap in policy, and how we could implement that in the battlefield. Thanks.
Abby, Caroline, Dowd, Gladys.
Oh, it's a big question, and again, I think it's. I think that I keep sort of focusing on doctrine, training, planning being absolutely critical in terms of, you know. We say generally at ICRC that we want to see states and non-state armed groups make protection of civilians a strategic priority, protection of the natural environment a strategic priority, but that has to filter all the way down even to the lowest, the tactical levels of operations, to make sure that the standard operating procedures, the rules of engagement, the decision makers are aware of the effects of their operations. And so, you know, one of the things that we would like to see is sort of for states to be more forthcoming about how they interpret those key rules of distinction, proportionality, and precautions when it comes to protection of the natural environment. We want to see more attention paid to the cumulative impact on the natural environment from the conduct of hostilities, which requires a strong evidence-based approach in order to be able to make those linkages between the causal links between, you know, particular attacks and then, you know, for example, the spread of infectious disease from, you know, deprivation of water. So, and the other thing is also exploring the need for protected, you know, protected zones for environmentally fragile areas of significance. So that's something that we have put forward as a recommendation as part of our environmental guidelines. We've also highlighted it in our recent challenges report, which I mentioned, and that's something that we would like to see states thinking more about the possible types of protections that could be given to these areas in order to reduce the risk.
Please.
Just a quick one. You know, the discussion centers on states when you look at it, because states have got the primary mandate to protect these natural resources, environment and water and other things. Now, the challenge actually is how do we, for example, target many countries at the same time? Here, we need to build on the existing synergies between states. Like on the African continent, we have got a regional economic mechanism. We have got, for example, I come from the East African community, now it is expanding. Started with 3 countries. We have added DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, Somalia, South Sudan, and other countries are coming on board. So that we have, for the militaries, we have a defense cooperation protocol, which allows us to train together, to do field training exercises, joint military exercises, so at least we harmonize our doctrines in terms of operations. In case there is a conflict, then we don't have different approaches to the protection of the water resources and other environments as such. So it is about filling that gap. How do you bring states which don't normally have the same doctrines to work together in an armed conflict situation? So we do scenario-based training programs, and they help us to build more synergies in protection of the water resources. Thank you.
Great. Any last, yeah, please.
I'll just also respond quickly. I think I'd encourage you to look at our website, and we published a report of the Inception workshop that we had in 2023 with the different partners. And I think that the critical part will be to continue the dialogue with militaries, with countries, with international organizations, civil society, on how to better protect, build the knowledge around the long-term impact of protracted conflicts for water, and through case studies. And then also this will lead to better informed policy, build on all the existing legal frameworks that are around. There's the UN security resolutions that were mentioned. There's also the WIPA declaration that is focusing more on urban centers, which is important to integrate. So have all these elements and then, yeah, work together to inform policy.
Great, thank you so much. So we will conclude here with the questions and answers and discussions, but we will be wrapping the session in a few minutes. And I think all the panelists are available just after if any of you have any follow-up questions or would like to speak with them bilaterally. But now it's with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker that will provide us the closing remarks. We have Mr. Roberto Cespedes, who is the Chargé d'Affaires from the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the UN in Geneva, and I'd like to hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for inviting the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica and for all the panelists and for the questions. I think this has been a very informative event. And just to begin this wrap-up, and I'd like to touch on a few things. First, the issue of information was referenced directly and indirectly by several of the speakers and even in some of the questions. That is something that is key. The issue of informing early stages of conflict and empowerment of the judiciary, that's also one thing that is also very important. And with that, just a suggestion to the panelists and to all of you here, it's not only about informing and empowering the judiciary, but about the lawyers, the judges, and law schools and law students. Environmental matters and armed conflicts is not discussed enough at universities, and it's only very specialized people that then have an interest. But if more work to be done at this stage, then the engagement, improvement of this knowledge around the world could improve. This also will influence policy that Caroline also alluded, and the sharing of knowledge. One of the other things that was key, and I would like to invite on reflection on this, also related to one of the questions on the visibility of this, what you called it, violence, is about accountability. It was mentioned several times, but in general, accountability efforts need to be strengthened for violations of international law, both humanitarian and human rights. Water and environmental issues are just getting started in this arena, and it's not to say that we don't need to strengthen our work there, but when impunity goes on over violations such as extrajudicial killings or enforced disappearances, then environmental things, let's be realistic, tend to be pushed aside. And so if we strengthen our efforts in ensuring accountability for all violations, and let's put it this way, the more classical violations, then this could open the door for these new kinds of violations of international law. But it's very difficult to start with accountability on a water issue if we don't have accountability for genocide, for example, right? So this needs to be strengthened. And in this regard, and I'm glad that no one mentioned this except for Ambassador Pipan at her introductory remarks, but we haven't spoken here about human rights and the importance of bringing these two issues together. And this is also in terms of information, and something that to fill a gap in policy, another question here. One of the key things that I think should be considered is pushing the knowledge that environmental human rights law and international human rights law and international humanitarian law are complementary and supplementary in application. This approach has been endorsed by the International Court of Justice, and this would strengthen the protection also of water issues, especially since we have already recognized the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, and the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So linking both human rights and humanitarian law is important and would contribute to a wider protection. Then I really appreciated the fact that we have here General Businge and our colleague Daud from Yemen talking about the complexities that soldiers face. It's very informative, especially for someone coming from a country with no army. But of course, we try to empathize with what they face. At the same time, it is important to push for more, again, knowledge and information on the principles of superior responsibility or chain of command responsibility, because even though we understand the difficulties that a soldier may face in obeying an order and abandoning, perhaps the only livelihood that they have in belonging to an army, it is also important that they know that they might be responsible eventually for a war crime, even if it's obeying an order from a superior and it's a difficult choice. But perhaps this principle should also be strengthened when speaking with armed groups in terms of also damaging water infrastructure or polluting water sources. Then one other thing that was mentioned about the damage of weapons to water sources. Also, it's important to try to focus our efforts on biodiversity. We didn't use, or I didn't hear this word very often. It was more natural environment, but the biodiversity track, it's another space where engagement and could be done to tackle water issues and bring in armed conflict into it. The use of chemical weapons that we all sadly hear about more and more has a huge impact on biodiversity, and we know that water depends on a healthy ecosystem. So that's one more thing to consider. Let me check all of my notes. Yes, on an interesting idea on the protected zones. I think that international humanitarian law has done a lot about this, and perhaps there's space to also expand their work in including some new categories, not only of infrastructure, but for natural sites, a bit what in the line of what UNESCO has been doing with the World Heritage in natural sites, which would again help protect water resources. And perhaps lastly, to conclude, there's an aspect that has not been mentioned, but I also encourage you this morning to consider, is the issue of gender in terms of water and armed conflicts. It is very important, and we need to recognize first the role that usually women and girls play in managing water resources. It was mentioned that, of course, water is used for cooking, for washing, for general use around the house, and in most countries around the world, these tasks still fall in the hands of women and girls. And moreover, they are the ones who usually go look for water in places where water is scarce. They are the ones who have a lot of control about the natural environment around water, both in terms of farmland or forests or jungles or biodiversity. So empowering women and engaging with them would also bring about an important part of the puzzle into play. And that's something that we should also consider. I think those are the main takeaways that I can share, and some of the ideas that I also wanted to share with you this morning. And of course, please count on our mission, keep engaging in this topic, and especially with our Ambassador Guillerme, who will also be chairing the drafting committee of the international conference of the ICRC in the next 2 weeks, where we'll also deal with these topics. But thank you, and have a good day.
So wonderful. It's on? Yes. Okay. So we are just at time. So I would like to again thank our distinguished speakers, those that provided the opening and closing remarks, Ambassador Pipin from Slovenia, as well as the Chargé de Affairs, Roberto Cespedes from Costa Rica. It was wonderful to have you both with us today. I would also like to send a big round of applause and thank you to our wonderful panelists. I think it was great to hear all of your excellent contributions today, and please do continue with the work that you're doing because it's very important. And thanks to all of you, the participants. I hope that you found the session engaging, and I hope that we've all taken something away from it today. I think the one thing I've taken away is accountability, and really thinking about what that means in light of what's happening in the world today, in light of the fact that we are here together to celebrate or commensurate the Geneva Peace Week, and of course keeping the focus on how we can spare water and wash infrastructure in armed conflicts, and how we can work together collectively to contribute to the alliance. Thank you to all. Have a great day.